There is a language sitting in museum vaults across 3 countries that no living person can read. Not a single word of it has been translated. Not a single sentence has been understood. Not a single phrase has been spoken aloud with any certainty for roughly 4,000 years. It was written by a civilization of perhaps 5 million people, one of the largest populations on the face of the earth at its time, a society that built planned cities with indoor plumbing and grain storage systems more advanced than anything Europe would see for thousands of years afterward. And yet their words remain locked, sealed, silent, uneachable. Over 4,000 individual symbols have been catalogued from their inscriptions. More than 400 distinct signs have been identified and numbered. Scholars have spent more than 150 years attempting to crack the code, to find some key, some pattern, some doorway into the meaning of those small carved marks. Supercomputers have been aimed at the problem. Linguists have devoted entire careers to it. Mathematicians have modelled it. Cryptographers have attacked it. Artificial intelligence researchers have trained algorithms on it. Every single one of them has failed. The script remains as opaque today as it was the day the first seal was pulled from the ground in the 1920s. The civilization is called the Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes known as the Harappan Civilization, named after one of its largest and earliest excavated cities. It flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, roughly 4,500 years ago, according to current archaeological estimates. At its height, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, an expanse of over 1 million square kilometers, stretching from the Himalayan foothills to the Arabian Sea coast, from the Iranian borderlands to the upper reaches of the Ganges Plain. Its cities were marvels of urban planning. Its trade networks stretched across the Arabian Sea to the ports of Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. Its people made exquisite jewelry from carnelian and lapis lazuli, fired pottery with geometric designs, carved figurines of dancing girls and seated figures in meditative poses, and built walls of fired brick with a precision that still puzzles modern engineers. And somewhere in the middle of all of that achievement, they developed a writing system. They carved it in small stone seals, pressed it into clay tablets, scratched it onto pottery shards and copper plates. They used it for something. Commerce, prayer, law, record-keeping, identity, administration. We do not know which. We cannot know, because the script has never been deciphered. Think about that for a moment. An entire civilization, spanning over 700 years in its mature urban phase alone, and perhaps 2,000 years in its total duration, left behind thousands of written artifacts, and we cannot read a single one of them. We know more about certain dead languages carved into rocks in deserts 10,000 kilometers away than we do about this one. We have translated Egyptian hieroglyphics. We have cracked Sumerian cuneiform. We have decoded Linear B from ancient Crete. We have made substantial progress on Maya glyphs, on Hittite, on Ugaritic, on dozens of scripts that once seemed hopelessly obscure. But the Indus script sits there, mocking every attempt, resisting every method, refusing every key that has ever been offered. It is, by nearly every academic measure, the single most important undeciphered writing system in the world. And it shows no signs of yielding. And it gets stranger. The inscriptions are short, shockingly short. The average text is fewer than 5 symbols long. Most inscriptions contain only 2, 3, or 4 signs. The longest known inscription contains only about 26 symbols. There is no bilingual text, no Rosetta Stone equivalent, no parallel translation in a known language that could serve as a bridge between the Indus symbols and any language we understand. Without that bridge, scholars are left staring at a locked door with no keyhole. Some researchers have even argued that the symbols are not writing at all, that they represent something else entirely. Perhaps clan emblems, religious markers, astrological notations, or trade tokens. If that argument is correct, it would mean that a civilization of millions, one that clearly had complex administration and long-distance trade, somehow operated without any form of written language whatsoever. That idea raises far more questions than it answers, and the implications either way are profound. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why this script has resisted translation for so long what the symbols might actually represent, what the greatest minds in archaeology and linguistics have tried and why they have failed, and what the silence of this writing system tells us about the fragility of human knowledge itself. You are going to see how an entire world of meaning can vanish, not because it was destroyed by fire or flood, but because no one was left who remembered how to read it. You are going to confront the possibility that we have permanently lost access to the thoughts, the beliefs, the stories, and the identity of one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. And you are going to wonder what that loss says about our own future. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let us begin. To understand why the Indus Valley script matters, and why its silence is so deeply disturbing, we first need to understand what kind of civilization produced it. We need to grasp its scale, its ambition, its sophistication, and its strange, quiet end, because this was not a small tribe scratching pictures on cave walls. This was not a minor settlement in a forgotten valley. This was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, standing alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia as one of the three earliest urban societies on Earth, and we have almost entirely forgotten it. The story of its rediscovery begins with a British Army deserter and an accident of colonial history. In 1826, a man named Charles Masson was wandering through the Punjab region of what is now Pakistan. His real name was James Lewis, and he was a former soldier who had deserted from the East India Company's Bengal artillery. Travelling under his assumed name, he moved through the landscape documenting ancient ruins, coins, and artifacts. Near a small village called Harappa, in what is now Punjab province, he noticed something unusual. The ground was littered with old bricks, not just a few scattered fragments, thousands of bricks, tens of thousands. They were uniform in size, remarkably well-fired and clearly ancient. Local villagers had been mining the site for building materials for generations, carrying away bricks by the cartload to build houses, line irrigation channels, and, later, to provide ballast for the Lahore Multan railway line. Masson described the ruins in his journal, noting what he thought was a damaged castle or fortress of considerable extent. He sketched the visible mounds. He noted the ancient coins he found scattered on the surface, but he did not realize what he was looking at. No one did. The mounds of Harappa would sit largely unstudied for another century, slowly being dismantled by villagers and railroad contractors before their true significance was understood. It was not until the 1920s that professional archaeologists turned their systematic attention to the site. In 1921, an Indian archaeologist named Daya Ram Sahni began formal excavations at Harappa under the auspices of the Archaeological Survey of India, then directed by Sir John Marshall. Around the same time, roughly 600 kilometers to the south, in what is now Sindh province, Pakistan, another archaeologist named Rakhal Das Banerjee was investigating a Buddhist stupa at a site called Mohenjo-daro. Beneath and around the stupa, Banerjee discovered something far older. What these two men found and what subsequent excavations over the following decades revealed stunned the academic world. Beneath the dirt and rubble lay entire cities, not rough settlements of haphazard huts, not crude villages of mud walls and thatch roofs, cities. Planned cities, with grid-patterned streets oriented to cardinal directions, standardized brick sizes consistent across the entire urban area, public baths lined with bitumen waterproofing, covered drainage systems running beneath the streets, granaries capable of storing vast quantities of grain, and multi-story buildings of fired brick construction. The level of urban planning was astonishing. The precision was almost eerie. Mohenjo-daro alone covered about 250 hectares at its peak, with a lower city of residential and commercial buildings and an elevated mound, often called the Citadel, containing larger public structures including the famous Great Bath, a carefully waterproofed rectangular pool roughly 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.5 meters deep. Harappa was nearly as large, with its own citadel, residential quarters, and what appear to be craft workshops. And as excavations continued over the following decades at other sites across the Indus floodplain and beyond, it became clear that these were not isolated urban centers. They were part of a vast interconnected network of settlements, ranging from major cities to small farming villages, spread across an enormous geographical area. Today, archaeologists have identified more than 1,400 settlement sites belonging to the Indus Valley Civilization, though estimates vary and new sites continue to be discovered. These sites are spread across an area of roughly 1.3 million square kilometers, an area larger than modern France and Germany combined. The civilization's territory stretched from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north, where sites like Manda have been found in Jammu, to the coast of the Arabian Sea in the south, where the port city of Lothal in Gujarat featured what appears to be a docking facility for seagoing vessels. From the Makran coast of Baluchistan in the west to sites along the upper Yamuna and Ganges rivers in the east, the Indus civilization's reach was extraordinary. According to population estimates, based on settlement sizes, densities, and agricultural carrying capacity of the region, the civilization may have supported between 1 million and 5 million people at its height, making it one of the most populous societies on the planet during the third millennium, before the Common Era. Some scholars have argued for the higher end of that range, noting the density of settlement sites in certain areas and the agricultural productivity of the Indus floodplain. Let us place that in perspective with a sense of historical scale. The civilization lasted, in its mature urban phase, from roughly 2600 to 1900 before the Common Era, according to standard archaeological dating based on radiocarbon measurements and stratigraphic analysis. That is approximately 700 years of sustained urban life, 700 years of planned cities, coordinated trade, standardized craft production, organized agriculture, and administrative governance. To put that duration in terms a modern person can feel, consider this: 700 years ago from today would take us back to the early 1300s of the Common Era. That was before the Black Death swept Europe, before the Renaissance, before the Reformation, before the voyages of Columbus, before the Industrial Revolution. 7 centuries is an immense span of time. It encompasses the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of nations, the transformation of entire continents. The Indus civilization endured for that long in its urban phase alone. Its total span, including the early Rabi phase settlements and the late Harappan period, may have stretched to over 2,000 years. If we were to imagine all of recorded human history, roughly 5,000 years since the earliest Sumerian texts, as a single human lifespan of 80 years, the Indus Valley civilization's mature phase would occupy roughly 11 of those years. That may sound modest, but consider that the classical Roman Republic, from its traditional founding to its transformation into the empire, lasted roughly 500 years. The British Empire, from its earliest colonial ventures in the 1600s to the dissolution of its major holdings in the mid-20th century, lasted roughly 350 years. The Indus civilization outlasted both. This was not a flash in the pan. This was not a temporary experiment. This was an enduring civilization, one that built, traded, governed, created, and wrote for generations upon generations. And yet, here is the first great mystery that sets the Indus apart from its contemporaries. Despite all of that complexity, despite all of that achievement, despite the obvious sophistication of its urban planning and material culture, the Indus Valley civilization left behind no monumental architecture that we can identify with certainty as a palace or a temple. There are no grand tombs filled with treasure, no pyramids reaching toward the sky, no ziggurats climbing in terraced steps, no obelisks carved with the names and deeds of mighty kings. In Egypt, we know the names of pharaohs stretching back thousands of years, inscribed on temple walls, carved into sarcophagi, written on papyrus scrolls. We know their battles, their marriages, their building projects, their boasts. In Mesopotamia, we have king lists that trace dynastic successions over millennia, law codes that regulate daily life in astonishing detail, epic poems that explore the meaning of mortality, and mountains of administrative records documenting everything from barley rations to temple offerings. From the Indus Valley, we have nothing of the kind. We do not know the name of a single ruler. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what gods they worshipped. or if they worshipped gods at all. We do not know their laws, their stories, their songs, or their prayers. We do not know how they organized their government, who made decisions, how authority was distributed, or how disputes were resolved. Everything we know about them comes from their material remains, their bricks, their beads, their bones, their tools, their pottery, and their enigmatic seals. Those seals are the heart of the mystery. They are small, usually square, typically about 2.5 centimeters on each side, though some are rectangular or circular. Most are carved from steatite, a soft stone also known as soapstone, which is easy to carve when fresh but hardens when fired. The carving technique is remarkably precise. The seals bear images, most commonly animals. A humped bull, sometimes called a zebu, appears frequently. Elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, water buffalo, and gharials, a type of long-snouted crocodilian, are also depicted. But the most common animal on the seals is a mysterious creature shown in profile with what appears to be a single horn, sometimes called the unicorn by scholars, though it may represent a two-horned animal seen from the side. This unicorn figure appears on roughly 60% of all seals, a dominance that has never been fully explained. In front of many of the animal figures, there is a strange object on a stand, sometimes it is described as a standard, or a feeding trough, or a ritual object. Its purpose is unknown. Above or beside the animal image, there is a short line of symbols. These symbols are the Indus script. They are the reason we are here tonight. The sheer standardization of the Indus material culture is one of the most remarkable aspects of this civilization, and it bears directly on the script question. Consider the weights. The Indus people used a system of cubical stone weights that followed a precise mathematical pattern. The weights were made from carefully shaped and polished stones, usually chert or agate, and they progressed in a binary ratio at the lower end, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and then shifted to a decimal system at higher values, 160, 320, 640, and so on. The base unit weighed approximately 0.87 grams, and this unit was consistent across the entire civilization, from Mohenjo-daro in the south to Harappa in the north, from Lothal on the coast to Shortagai in northern Afghanistan, over 1,500 kilometers away. The precision of these weights is extraordinary. Many of them deviate from the theoretical value by less than 1%. This level of standardization, maintained across a territory of over 1 million square kilometers, without, as far as we know, a central government issuing decrees or a bureaucracy enforcing compliance, is without parallel in the ancient world. The brick sizes tell the same story. Throughout the Indus territory, bricks were made in a standard ratio of 1:2:4, the thickness being 1 unit, the width 2 units, and the length 4 units. The absolute size varied slightly between sites, but the proportional ratio was maintained everywhere. This is not something that happens by accident. It requires either a central authority setting standards or a deeply embedded cultural tradition transmitted through apprenticeship and practice. Either way, it implies a level of coordination that seems to demand some form of record-keeping or written communication. How else do you ensure that a brickmaker in the coastal city of Lothal, 2,000 years into the tradition, is still using the same proportions as a brickmaker in the northern city of Harappa? Oral tradition alone seems insufficient to maintain that degree of precision over such vast distances and such long periods. And yet, the only candidates for a written component of that coordination, the inscriptions on the seals, remain unread. The trade networks add another layer of complexity to the picture. Indus Valley artifacts have been found at sites across the Persian Gulf, in Mesopotamia, and in Central Asia. Carnelian beads from the Indus workshops of Mohenjo-daro and other sites have been found in the royal tombs of Ur in southern Iraq. Indus-type weights and seals have been discovered at Bahrain, at Failaka Island in Kuwait, and at coastal sites in Oman. A trading colony or enclave of Indus merchants may have existed at Shortugai in northern Afghanistan, where lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan was probably gathered for export southward. The scale and complexity of this trade required logistical coordination, tracking shipments, recording transactions, identifying ownership, measuring quantities, and settling disputes. In every other ancient trading civilization that we know of, such activities required writing. The Sumerians kept meticulous records of every barley ration and wool consignment. The Egyptians documented every quarrying expedition and temple gift. The Indus people, apparently, either used their script for similar purposes, in which case we cannot read their commercial records, or they managed one of the ancient world's most extensive trade networks without written records, which would be unprecedented. More than 4,000 inscribed objects have been found across the civilization's territory. Seals, seal impressions on clay, miniature tablets, pottery graffiti, copper tablets, bone rods, and even a few inscriptions on metal objects. The symbols themselves number somewhere between 400 and 417 distinct signs, depending on how scholars count variants, and whether certain marks are treated as independent signs or as modified forms of other signs. This number carries significance. It is far too large to represent an alphabet, which typically has between 20 and 40 symbols. English, for example, uses 26 letters. Arabic uses 28. Even scripts with large alphabets, like Georgian with 38 letters, fall well below the Indus sign count. At the same time, 400 signs is far too small to be a purely logographic system, a system where each symbol represents an entire word. Chinese, the best-known logographic system still in use, requires knowledge of several thousand characters for basic literacy. The Indus sign count falls into an intermediate range that suggests what linguists call a logosyllabic system, a writing method that combines symbols representing whole words, called logograms, with symbols representing syllable sounds, called syllabograms. This is the same general category as Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics. But without a translation, that classification remains educated guesswork. The math is striking when we consider the sheer volume of failed attempts. Since the 1920s, well over 100 serious decipherment proposals have been published in academic journals, books, and conference proceedings. Scholars have proposed that the script encodes Dravidian languages, Indo-Aryan languages, Sumerian, Proto-Elamite, Munda languages, and even language families with no known modern descendants whatsoever. Some proposals have been presented with enormous confidence, accompanied by detailed reading systems, proposed vocabularies, and grammatical analyses. A few have received initial attention and even qualified endorsement from respected colleagues. None have achieved anything close to consensus. Not a single one. In the entire history of epigraphy, the academic study of inscriptions and writing systems, there is no other script that has attracted so many attempts and yielded so few accepted results. To understand why this is the case, we need to compare the Indus script problem to other decipherment successes and see what those successes had that this problem lacks. Egyptian hieroglyphics were cracked in the 1820s by the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, building on earlier work by Thomas Young. The critical tool was the Rosetta Stone, a slab of granodiorite discovered in 1799 by French soldiers in the Nile Delta. The stone bore the same royal decree inscribed in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Ancient Greek. Because scholars could read the Greek text, they had a direct translation that allowed them to work backward into the unknown scripts, matching Greek names to their hieroglyphic equivalents, and gradually building up a reading system. Linear B, a script used by the Mycenaean civilization of Bronze Age Greece, was decoded in 1952 by the British architect Michael Ventris, who realized, after years of painstaking analysis, that the script represented an early form of Greek. He had crucial help from the American scholar Alice Kober, whose rigorous analysis of sign patterns in the years before her early death laid the essential groundwork. The key in both cases was a connection to a known language. Champollion had Greek. Ventris ultimately had Greek. The decipherers had a bridge from the unknown to the known. The Indus script has nothing of the sort. There is no bilingual inscription. There is no known descendant language that can be confidently linked to the Indus people. And the texts themselves are heartbreakingly, almost cruelly, short. Here is a comparison that makes the problem vivid and almost physically painful for anyone who has worked on it. The total corpus of Indus script inscriptions, every text ever found on every seal, tablet, pottery shard, copper plate, and bone rod, across more than 1,400 sites spanning over 1 million square kilometers, contains roughly 4,200 individual sign occurrences. If you were to type them all out, one after another, character by character, they would fill perhaps 2 pages of ordinary text. 2 pages. That is the sum total of everything this civilization wrote that has survived to reach us. The average inscription is fewer than 5 characters long. Many inscriptions contain only a single symbol. The longest known inscription, found on a large signboard at the site of Dholavira in Gujarat, India, contains about 26 symbols. By contrast, when Champollion deciphered hieroglyphics, he had access to thousands of inscriptions, many of them hundreds or thousands of words long, plus the bilingual Rosetta Stone. When Ventris cracked Linear B, he had roughly 1,000 tablets containing tens of thousands of sign occurrences. The Indus decipherers have almost nothing to work with. They are trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with 99% of the pieces missing. Some scholars have described the situation as trying to decode an entire language from a collection of business cards. Imagine someone handed you 3,000 small cards, each bearing between 2 and 5 symbols from a completely unknown writing system, with no translation guide, no dictionary, no grammar book, and no knowledge of what language the symbols represent. You do not even know if the symbols represent a language at all. Could you crack it? Could any human being alive? Could any computer? The archaeological context provides some help, but not nearly enough. The seals appear to have been used in trade and administration. Many have been found at Indus Valley sites alongside clear evidence of commercial activity. Cubical stone weights following a standardized system, measuring sticks, storage jars, and structures that may have served as warehouses or dockyard facilities. Some Indus seals have been found far from the Indus heartland in Mesopotamia, in the Persian Gulf region, in Central Asia, suggesting long-distance trade contacts. A few Mesopotamian cuneiform texts from the Akkadian period and later refer to a land called Meluha, which many scholars believe corresponds to the Indus Valley region. These texts describe Meluha as a source of luxury goods, carnelian beads, ivory, fine timber, exotic animals. But the Mesopotamian texts do not provide translations of Indus script. They confirm that the two civilizations knew of each other, traded with each other, and perhaps even had interpreters who could facilitate communication between them. But those interpreters left no dictionaries, no phrasebooks, no word lists. The bridge between the Indus language and any language we can read was never built, or if it was built on materials that did not survive. There is one more piece of context that deepens the mystery before we move forward. Around 1900 before the Common Era, according to the archaeological record, the major cities of the Indus Valley civilization began to decline. Mohenjo-daro shows signs of deterioration in its upper levels, sloppier construction, reuse of old bricks, encroachment of small structures into formerly open spaces, breakdown of the drainage system, and what some archaeologists have interpreted as evidence of overcrowding and social stress. Harappa shows a similar pattern. By roughly 1700 before the Common Era, the great cities had been largely abandoned. The population did not simply vanish into thin air. People moved to smaller settlements, many of them to the east and south, toward the Ganges-Yamuna river systems and into Gujarat. They continued to live, to farm, to make pottery, to raise children. But the urban civilization, with its planned cities, its standardized weights, its coordinated administration, and its writing system, was gone, and with it went the script. After the civilization's decline, the Indus script disappears completely from the archaeological record. No later culture in the region continued to use it. No successor civilization adopted or adapted it. It was not gradually replaced by a newer, better system. It was simply abandoned, forgotten, as though it had never existed. The causes of the decline remain debated, but the leading theories all point to environmental factors. Geological and hydrological studies have shown that the Gagahakra river system, which watered many of the eastern Indus settlements, underwent significant changes during the second millennium before the Common Era. The rivers shifted course, some tributaries dried up, and the reliable water supply that had sustained dense agricultural populations diminished. At the same time, paleoclimatic data suggests that the Indian monsoon may have weakened during this period, reducing rainfall across the Indus region. Reduced water availability would have undermined agriculture, which was the economic foundation of the civilization. Cities that depended on agricultural surpluses to feed their non-farming populations, the craft workers, administrators, traders, and ritual specialists, would have been the first to suffer. As agricultural productivity declined, the economic rationale for maintaining large, complex urban centers weakened. People moved to smaller settlements where they could grow their own food. The elaborate administrative infrastructure that had coordinated the civilization's vast territory was no longer needed, and with the dissolution of that infrastructure, the institutions that had sustained literacy, whatever they were, dissolved as well. That disappearance raises a question that goes far beyond archaeology. If a writing system can be forgotten completely and permanently by a civilization of millions, what else can be forgotten? What other achievements of the human mind have simply slipped through the cracks of time, leaving no trace, no memory, no echo in the cultures that came after? But what scientists discovered next was worse than anyone expected. The core problem with the Indus Valley script is not simply that it is undeciphered. Many scripts have been undeciphered at various points in history, and many have eventually yielded their secrets to patient, brilliant scholars. The problem with the Indus script is different. It is structural. The very tools and methods that have successfully cracked other ancient writing systems do not work here. Every approach, every technique, every analytical framework that scholars have developed over 2 centuries of epigraphy encounters a wall when applied to the Indus symbols. And the deeper researchers dig into the problem, the more they understand that the wall may not be penetrable, not because scholars are not clever enough, but because the evidence that would make decipherment possible may no longer exist anywhere on Earth. To understand this impasse, let us walk through the standard decipherment toolkit, the set of strategies that linguists and epigraphers have developed and refined over the centuries, and examine, one by one, why each approach fails when confronted with the Indus script. The first and most powerful tool in the decipherer's arsenal is the bilingual text. A bilingual text is an inscription that presents the same message in 2 or more writing systems, at least one of which is already understood by modern scholars. The Rosetta Stone is the most famous example. It was carved in 196 before the Common Era, during the reign of Ptolemy V, and bore a priestly decree in 3 scripts: Classical Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and Hieroglyphic Egyptian. Because 19th century scholars could read the Greek portion fluently, they could work backward, comparing the Greek text to the unknown scripts, and gradually identifying correspondences. This process was not quick or easy. It took decades of work by multiple scholars. But the bilingual provided the essential starting point, a foothold from which the climb could begin. Similarly, the Behistun inscription in Iran, carved on a cliff face by the Persian king Darius the Great around 515 before the Common Era, presented the same royal proclamation in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. Henry Rawlinson's work on this inscription in the 1830s and 40s helped unlock the cuneiform writing systems of Mesopotamia. No bilingual text exists for the Indus script. None has ever been found, despite more than a century of searching. Archaeologists have hoped that somewhere, perhaps at a coastal trading post, where Indus merchants met their Mesopotamian counterparts, a seal or tablet might turn up bearing both Indus symbols and a translatable Mesopotamian inscription. Some objects found in the Persian Gulf region, particularly at sites in Bahrain, ancient Dilmun, and along the Omani coast, show signs that might be hybrid inscriptions, or at least evidence of cross-cultural contact. A few round seals found in the Gulf, sometimes called Persian Gulf seals, bear symbol systems that seem to blend Indus and local traditions. But nothing definitive enough to serve as a decipherment key has emerged. Without a bilingual, the most direct and historically proven path to deciphering an unknown script is blocked entirely. The second major tool is knowledge of the underlying language. Even without a bilingual text, if you know or can guess what language a script encodes, you can test hypotheses against the known vocabulary, grammar, and phonology of that language. Michael Ventris cracked Linear B partly through a brilliant intuition. He guessed that the language behind the script might be an early form of Greek. This was a controversial hypothesis at the time, because most scholars believed the Mycenaeans spoke a non-Greek language, but Ventris tested his guess by assigning provisional sound values to linear B symbols and checking whether the resulting words looked like Greek. When they did, when tablet after tablet produced recognizable Greek words for familiar concepts like tripods, horses, and barley, the case was made. The hypothesis worked because there was a living linguistic descendant, classical and modern Greek, that preserved enough of the ancient vocabulary and grammar to serve as a reference point. But here is the problem. We do not know what language the Indus Valley people spoke. This is not a minor gap, it is a chasm. The leading hypothesis, championed for decades by the Finnish Indologist Asko Parpala, is that the Indus script represents a Dravidian language, an ancestor of modern Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, or Malayalam. Parpola has built a careful and elaborate case, drawing on the geographical distribution of Dravidian languages in South Asia, on structural features of the sign sequences, on possible semantic connections between Indus symbols and Dravidian words, and on parallels between Indus iconography and later Dravidian religious traditions. His work is widely respected, but it has not achieved consensus. Other scholars, particularly those influenced by the historical linguistics of South Asia, have argued that the language could have been Indo-Aryan, related to Sanskrit and its modern descendants like Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali. Still others have proposed Proto-Munda, a member of the Austroasiatic language family represented today by languages like Santali and Mundari, spoken by tribal communities in eastern India, and a significant number of scholars have suggested that the Indus language may belong to an entirely unknown language family, a linguistic isolate with no modern descendants whatsoever, like Sumerian or Basque. Each of these hypotheses has implications for how the script might be read, but none can be confirmed without an independent means of verification. If you assume the language is Dravidian and assign readings accordingly, you can produce proposed translations that look plausible to someone who expects Dravidian readings. If you assume Indo-Aryan, you get different readings that look plausible from that perspective. Without an external check, a bilingual text, or a confirmed connection to a known language, there is no way to determine which readings, if any, are correct. The hypotheses are not tested against reality. They are tested against themselves. That is a methodological dead end. The third tool is structural analysis. Even if you do not have a bilingual and do not know the language, you can study the internal structure of the inscription corpus itself. You can count how many distinct symbols exist. You can measure how frequently each symbol appears. You can map which symbols tend to appear together, which symbols are found at the beginning versus the end of inscriptions, which symbols seem to modify other symbols, and which symbols appear in isolation versus in clusters. This kind of distributional analysis has been productive for many undeciphered scripts. It was essential for Ventris's work on Linear B. It has been applied extensively to scripts like Linear A, Proto-Elamite, and Rongorongo. Structural analysis of the Indus script has yielded some results, but they are frustratingly limited and ambiguous. Scholars have determined that the script was probably written from right to left, based on the observation that symbols tend to be more crowded on the left side of seals, suggesting that the carver began on the right and ran out of space as they moved leftward. They have identified certain symbols that appear with high frequency at the beginning of inscriptions and others that cluster at the end, a pattern that might indicate prefixes and suffixes, which would be consistent with the script encoding a language with agglutinative morphology. They have noted recurring pairs and triplets of symbols that might represent common words or formulaic phrases. Iravatham Mahadevan, the Indian epigrapher who devoted his life to the Indus script, compiled detailed concordances and positional frequency analyses that demonstrated considerable regularity in the sign sequences. But every pattern that has been identified has multiple possible interpretations. A symbol that always appears at the end of a text might be a grammatical suffix, or it might be a standard closing formula like sincerely at the end of a letter, or it might be a classifier marking the category of the object described, or it might be decorative. With texts averaging fewer than 5 symbols, the statistical base is simply too thin to distinguish between these possibilities with confidence. In statistical terms, the sample size is far below the threshold needed for reliable inference. You cannot determine the grammar of a language from a corpus that would fit on 2 pages. And it gets worse. In 2004, a bombshell landed in the field of Indus studies. A team of 3 scholars, Steve Farmer, an independent historian of ideas, Richard Sproat, a computational linguist at the Oregon Health and Science University, and Michael Witzel, a Harvard Sanskritist, published a paper with a deliberately provocative title that argued the Indus symbols were not writing at all. Their argument was meticulous and multi-pronged. They observed that the inscriptions are extremely short, far shorter than any known corpus of writing from a literate civilization. They noted that the longest Indus inscription, at roughly 26 symbols, is shorter than many individual words in languages with complex morphology. They pointed out that no long texts have been found anywhere in the Indus cultural sphere. No letters, no contracts, no stories, no administrative lists, no ritual formulas, nothing that resembles the kinds of extended prose or even extended notation that characterize every known literate society. They observed that the Indus symbols show limited evidence of the kind of syntactic structure, the ordered arrangement of signs according to grammatical rules, that defines true writing. And they proposed an alternative interpretation, that the symbols were a system of non-linguistic notation, perhaps religious or clan emblems, identity markers, ownership stamps, or ritual symbols, comparable to heraldic devices in medieval Europe or potter's marks in various ancient cultures. This argument hit the academic community with the force of a detonation. The reaction was immediate and fierce, particularly from South Asian scholars. Parpala called the proposal absurd. Mahadevan marshalled his decades of analysis to argue that the sign sequences showed clear evidence of linguistic patterning, pointing to the existence of what appeared to be compound signs, signs that modified other signs in systematic ways, positional regularities that suggested word order, and recurring sequences that were too structured to be random arrangements of emblems. The debate became politically charged, with some Indian commentators viewing the Farmer-Sproat-Witzel thesis as an attempt to diminish the significance of Indian civilization by denying it literacy. The controversy spilled out of academic journals into newspapers, blogs, and public forums. The political dimension of this debate should not be underestimated. In India and Pakistan, the Indus Valley civilization is a matter of national pride. The possibility that this great civilization was literate, that it possessed a full writing system comparable to those of Egypt and Mesopotamia, carries enormous cultural weight. The suggestion that the Indus symbols might be mere emblems or tokens rather than true writing was perceived by many South Asian scholars and commentators as reductive, dismissive, and culturally insensitive. Conversely, some Western scholars argued that the desire to see the Indus symbols as writing was itself driven by cultural and nationalistic motivations rather than by the evidence. The debate thus acquired a dimension that went beyond pure scholarship, touching on questions of identity, cultural heritage, and the politics of who gets to define the past. But the purely scholarly questions remain, and they are formidable. One approach that has shed light on the problem, even without resolving it, is the study of sign frequency distributions. In any writing system, certain symbols appear far more often than others. In English, the letter E is by far the most common, followed by T, A, and O. This frequency distribution follows a predictable mathematical pattern described by what is known as Zipf's law, named after the linguist George Kingsley Zipf. The frequency of any symbol is inversely proportional to its rank in the frequency table. The most common symbol appears roughly twice as often as the second most common, 3 times as often as the third, and so on. Linguistic systems tend to follow Zipf's law with reasonable accuracy. Non-linguistic symbol systems sometimes do and sometimes do not. Analyses of the Indus sign corpus have shown that its frequency distribution follows Zipf's law reasonably well, which is consistent with, but does not prove, a linguistic interpretation. The problem is that Zipf's law is a necessary but not sufficient condition for language. A system can follow Zipf's law without being linguistic, but a linguistic system that does not follow Zipf's law would be very unusual. Another analytical approach has focused on the question of sign variety versus text length. In most writing systems, there is a predictable relationship between how long a text is and how many different symbols it contains. Short texts use relatively few different symbols, while longer texts introduce progressively more variety, because rarer symbols are more likely to appear in longer passages. This relationship, sometimes called the type-token ratio, follows characteristic curves for linguistic versus non-linguistic systems. Analyses of the Indus corpus have produced mixed results on this measure, partly because the texts are so short that the statistical behavior is dominated by the most common signs and the rarer signs barely appear at all. It is as though you were trying to determine the letter frequency of English from a collection of two-word texts. You would see thee and off and in constantly, but you might never encounter Z or X or Q. The sample would give a distorted picture of the full system. In 2009, a team from the University of Washington, led by the physicist Rajesh Rao, published a study in the journal Science that attempted to settle the question using sophisticated computational methods. Rao and his colleagues analyzed the conditional entropy of the Indus symbol sequences, a mathematical measure of how much the identity of a given symbol depends on the identity of the symbols that precede it. In a truly random sequence, each symbol is independent of the others, and the conditional entropy is high. In a structured system like language, each symbol is partly predicted by its context, and the conditional entropy is lower. Rao's team compared the Indus script's conditional entropy to that of known linguistic scripts, including Sumerian cuneiform, Old Tamil, Sanskrit and English, as well as to non-linguistic symbol systems like DNA-based sequences, Fortran programming code, and artificially generated random sequences. Their results showed that the Indus script's conditional entropy fell squarely within the range of linguistic systems and outside the range of non-linguistic ones. The paper was widely reported in the press as computational evidence that the Indus symbols were indeed a form of writing. But the celebration was premature. Sproat and Farmer responded with a detailed and technically rigorous critique. They demonstrated that Rao's method was fundamentally unable to distinguish between true writing and various kinds of structured non-linguistic symbol systems. They showed that heraldic sequences, sets of symbols used in European coat of arms designs, could also produce conditional entropy values within the linguistic range. They argued that the test was measuring the degree of sequential structure in a symbol system, not whether that structure was linguistic in nature. Many non-linguistic systems, including musical notation, mathematical formulae, and even certain card games, have sequential structure. Structure alone does not prove language. Rao's team published a defense of their methodology, and further exchanges followed. The debate generated heat but not resolution. It remains one of the most contentious questions in modern archaeology. This is the fundamental impasse, the core problem that makes the Indus script different from every other undeciphered writing system on Earth. The script might be writing. It might encode a language, with words and grammar and syntax, capable of expressing any thought that an Indus Valley person might have wished to communicate. Or it might not be writing at all. It might be a system of symbols with meaning but without language, communicating identity or category or ritual status through convention rather than through phonetic encoding. And with the evidence currently available, with a corpus of short inscriptions averaging fewer than 5 symbols, with no bilingual, with no confirmed underlying language, with no long texts, and with a statistical base too thin for reliable computational analysis, we may never be able to determine which possibility is correct. Something is wrong with our assumptions. We have always treated writing as the hallmark of civilization, the dividing line between prehistory and history, the essential companion to complex society. The Indus Valley challenges that assumption more forcefully than any other case in the human record. If these people had writing, we cannot read it. If they did not have writing, we cannot explain how they managed the astonishing uniformity and coordination of their civilization without it. How do you standardize brick dimensions across 1 million square kilometers without written specifications? How do you maintain a uniform system of weights and measures across hundreds of settlements without written standards. How do you coordinate the construction of planned cities with grid streets and underground drainage without blueprints, plans, or administrative records? Either the Indus people wrote and we have lost their writing, or they achieved something that no other known civilization has achieved: complex urban administration without literacy. Both possibilities should make us deeply uneasy. The first, that the Indus people had a full writing system that we cannot read, means that the evidence for an entire civilization's intellectual life has been lost. It means that somewhere in the ruins of these cities, there may once have been archives, schools, and scriptoria, entire institutions dedicated to the production and preservation of written knowledge, and every trace of them has been devoured by time and decay. It means that the 2 pages of short seal inscriptions that survive are not the totality of Indus writing, but merely the accidentally preserved remnant of a much larger body of text, most of which was committed to perishable materials that rotted away millennia ago. If this is true, the Indus case represents one of the greatest information losses in history, so complete that we cannot even estimate what was lost. The second possibility, that the Indus people operated without writing, is in some ways even more disorienting. It would mean that our entire framework for understanding the relationship between literacy and societal complexity is wrong. It would mean that a society of millions, with standardized systems of weights, measures, and construction, with long-distance trade networks, with planned cities and sophisticated hydraulic engineering, managed all of this through oral communication, institutional memory, and face-to-face coordination alone. That would be an extraordinary achievement, perhaps as remarkable as the writing systems we celebrate in other civilizations. But it would also mean that oral knowledge systems are far more powerful and sophisticated than we generally credit, capable of maintaining precision and consistency across vast distances and centuries of time without the aid of written records. Let us look more closely at what the physical evidence tells us. The corpus of Indus inscriptions, compiled most comprehensively in Iravatham Mahadevan's Concordance, published in 1977, and updated in subsequent work, includes texts from over 2,500 objects found at dozens of sites. The majority of inscriptions appear on seals and their clay impressions. The seals are carved in intaglio, meaning the image and text are cut into the surface so that when pressed into wet clay, they produce a raised impression. This is consistent with use as stamps for marking goods, authenticating shipments, or identifying ownership. Some inscriptions appear on miniature tablets of clay or faience that may have been amulets or tokens. Others are scratched onto pottery before or after firing, a practice known as graffiti, which might represent casual marks by potters or owners. A small number of inscriptions appear on copper tablets or other metal objects. Certain signs appear with remarkably high frequency. The jar sign, a symbol resembling a vessel or pot, appears in roughly 10% of all inscriptions, a symbol that scholars call the fish sign, because it resembles a stylized fish, is also very common, and a series of fish variants: fish with added strokes, fish with diamond shapes, fish with roof-like additions, form one of the most intensively studied groups in the corpus. Parpola has argued that the basic fish symbol represents the Dravidian word min, which in several Dravidian languages means both fish and star. If the Indus script is logosyllabic and the underlying language is Dravidian, then a fish symbol reading min could serve dual duty, representing the concept of fish in one context and the concept of star in another, with the added strokes functioning as determinatives that specify which meaning is intended. A fish with a roof-like addition might mean house star, perhaps a reference to a planet. A fish with 6 strokes might mean 6 stars, perhaps the Pleiades. These proposals are elegant, internally consistent, and completely unverifiable. They demonstrate the seductive danger of the Indus script. It is easy to construct plausible-seeming readings that cannot be confirmed or denied, because the corpus is too small and no external check exists. Other patterns in the data offer tantalizing but inconclusive hints. Certain sequences of 2 or 3 signs recur across multiple seals from different sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, suggesting that these were formulaic expressions, perhaps titles, names, or standard phrases that carried recognized meaning across the civilization. Some signs appear almost exclusively at the beginning texts, while others cluster at the end. This positional behavior is consistent with a language that uses prefixes and suffixes, a feature common to many language families including Dravidian. But the same pattern could arise in a non-linguistic notation system that follows a fixed format, the way a modern business card puts the name at the top and the phone number at the bottom. Format is not grammar. Convention is not syntax. The physical objects themselves provide one more layer of evidence. The clay ceilings, lumps of clay bearing seal impressions, have been found in contexts suggesting they were used to secure goods in transit. At the site of Lothal, clay ceilings were found in what appears to have been a warehouse or dockyard area. At Mohenjo-daro, ceilings were recovered from structures that may have been administrative offices or customs facilities. If the seals functioned as commercial labels, the inscriptions might identify the sender, the recipient, the contents, or the authority under which the goods were shipped. That would explain why the texts are so short. A name and a title need only a few symbols. But it would also mean that we are looking at only a tiny, specialized subset of the Indus people's potential written output, the equivalent of judging the entire literary output of English civilization, based solely on the text printed on shipping labels. That leads to perhaps the most important and most painful possibility. The Indus people may well have written longer texts on materials that have not survived the intervening millennia. In a tropical or semi-tropical climate like that of the Indus floodplain, organic materials decay rapidly. Palm leaves, bark strips, cotton cloth, wooden boards, all materials used for writing in later periods in South Asia, would have disintegrated within decades, or at most centuries, of being produced. If the Indus people kept their administrative records, religious texts, literary works, and personal correspondence on such materials, then their entire literary heritage has been lost not to conquest or catastrophe, but simply to chemistry. The microorganisms in the soil did what no army could do. They erased a civilization's voice. This is a real possibility. It is even, some scholars argue, the most likely possibility. But it is also unfalsifiable. We cannot prove that long texts once existed because the absence of evidence is, in this case, exactly what we would expect whether the texts existed or not. There is one discovery that tantalizingly suggests the Indus people used their symbols for more than just seal labels. At the site of Dholavira, a walled city in the Rann of Kutch, in Gujarat, India, archaeologists, led by Ravindra Singh Bish, discovered in 1990 a remarkable object, a large wooden signboard. The board itself had decayed long ago, but the symbols that were once affixed to it had survived because they were made from pieces of a white crystalline material, probably gypsum, that had fallen to the ground in a recognizable arrangement when the board disintegrated. There were roughly 10 individual symbols, each about 37 centimeters tall, arranged in a row. This is the largest known Indus inscription, not in terms of the number of symbols, but in terms of the physical size of the individual characters. The symbols were clearly meant to be read from a distance. They were mounted on a signboard that appears to have been displayed above or near the main gateway of the city, facing outward toward arriving visitors or traders. This is not a seal impression. This is not a potter's mark. This is a public sign, mounted at the entrance to a major city, designed to be seen and read by passers-by. It implies a literate audience. It implies that people approaching Dholavira were expected to understand the symbols. It implies that the symbols communicated a message that was important enough to warrant a large, permanent, publicly displayed sign. What was that message? A city name? A royal title? A religious declaration? A trade announcement? A warning? We do not know. We cannot read it. But the very existence of the sign suggests strongly that the Indus symbols were more than private marks on personal seals. They were a medium of public communication. They were writing, in the fullest social sense of the word, even if we cannot technically prove that they encode language. The Dholavira signboard also raises another possibility. If the Indus people had large public signs, they may have had other forms of public writing as well. Inscriptions on walls, painted signs, carved announcements, posted regulations. All of these would have been made from perishable materials, or would have been on surfaces that weathered away over the millennia. The signboard at Dolavira was preserved only because the gypsum symbols were more durable than the wood they were mounted on. How many other signs, made from less durable materials, have been lost entirely? The 2 pages of text we possess may represent not the full output of Indus writing, but a tiny, atypical sliver of it, the portion that happened to be inscribed on stone and fired clay, the most durable media available. It is as though future archaeologists, excavating our civilization, found only coins, stamps, and license plates, and tried to reconstruct the English language from the text printed on them. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The Indus script does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a broader pattern, a pattern of civilizations that built extraordinary things and then vanished, leaving behind ruins that later peoples could not explain, records that later scholars could not read, and silences that have never been filled. To understand what the Indus script's muteness truly means, we need to see it alongside other great disappearances, other collapses, other erasures from the human record. Each one illuminates the same unsettling truth. The past is not a stable archive waiting to be consulted. It is a crumbling edifice that loses rooms, floors, and entire wings with every passing century. Let us begin with the civilization that presents the most disturbing parallel to the Indus Valley's problem of unreadable symbols. Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited a hilltop site in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Sanliurfa, that had been briefly surveyed and dismissed by an American team in the 1960s as nothing more than a medieval cemetery. The Americans had noticed some carved stones protruding from the surface, but had not dug deep enough to understand what lay beneath. Schmidt looked at the same stones and saw something different. He began excavating. What he found beneath the surface was nothing short of staggering. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, were arranged in circular enclosures. The pillars were carved with elaborate animal reliefs: foxes, boars, cranes, snakes, spiders, scorpions, and vultures. Some pillars bore what appeared to be human arms carved in low relief along their sides, as though the pillars themselves represented stylized human figures. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest construction phases at roughly 9,600 years before the Common Era, making the site, according to current scientific estimates, more than 6,000 years older than Stonehenge and more than 4,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. These were the oldest known monumental stone structures on Earth, and they were built by hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet developed agriculture, pottery, or metallurgy. The discovery rewrote textbooks. Scholars had long assumed that monumental architecture required settled agricultural communities with food surpluses, specialized labor divisions, and hierarchical political organization. Göbekli Tepe demolished that assumption. Here was a site that required the coordinated effort of hundreds of workers, quarrying, transporting, carving, and erecting massive stones, all accomplished by mobile bands of foragers who grew no crops and kept no domestic animals. Schmidt argued that the impulse to build communal ritual spaces might have preceded and even driven the transition to agriculture. People did not settle down and then build temples. They may have built temples first and then settled down to sustain them. The orthodox model of civilization's origins was, quite literally, inverted. But here is what concerns us tonight. Göbekli Tepe has symbols, carved into the pillars, etched onto the smaller stones, and incised on portable objects found at the site. There are various pictographic marks, stylized animals, geometric shapes, abstract patterns, and what some scholars have tentatively identified as proto-symbolic notation. These marks have not been deciphered. Their meaning, if they have meaning beyond decoration, is unknown. They might represent an early attempt at symbolic communication, a step on the long road toward writing, or they might be purely artistic. Without a decipherment key, and with no connection to any known later symbol system, they remain as mute as the Indus script. though far older, and then the site was buried, deliberately. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the people who used Göbekli Tepe began filling in the circular enclosures with rubble, earth, and refuse. They buried the pillars carefully, covering the carved surfaces completely. They did this over a period of time, enclosure by enclosure, until the entire site was hidden beneath an artificial hill. Then they walked away. The site lay undisturbed for roughly 10,000 years, until Schmidt's excavations in the 1990s. The act of burial is extraordinary. It is as though the builders wanted to seal away their own creation, to hide it from future eyes, to erase it from the landscape. Whether this was an act of reverence, of rejection, of ritual closure, or of something else entirely, we cannot say. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe left no written explanation. Now let us travel to the opposite side of the world. In the American Southwest, in the Red Rock Canyons and high mesas of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, there once flourished a people whom archaeologists now call the ancestral Puebloans. Though they were long known by the Navajo term Anasazi, they built one of the most architecturally stunning civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. At Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado, they constructed elaborate cliff dwellings, multi-room stone structures nestled into the natural alcoves of sandstone canyon walls, some of them accessible only by narrow handholds carved into the rock face. At Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico, between roughly 850 and 1150 of the Common Era, they built great houses of astonishing scale and ambition. Pueblo Bonito, the largest great house, contained over 600 rooms, rose 4 or 5 stories high, and covered nearly 2 hectares. Its construction required an estimated 215,000 timbers, most of them ponderosa pine and spruce beams transported from forests over 80 kilometers away, across open desert, without the aid of wheeled vehicles, draft animals, or metal tools. The effort this represented is difficult to comprehend. Thousands of heavy logs, each weighing hundreds of kilograms, carried by human hands across vast stretches of arid landscape. The organizational capacity required to coordinate such an undertaking rivals anything in the ancient world. Chaco Canyon was not merely a settlement. It was a ceremonial and political center connected to a network of outlying communities by carefully constructed roads, some of them 30 or more feet wide, running in straight lines across the desert for tens of kilometers. The roads connected Chaco to over 150 outlying great houses and smaller settlements spread across tens of thousands of square kilometers. This Chaco world, as archaeologists call it, represented a regional system of extraordinary complexity involving centralized ritual, organized labor, long-distance resource procurement, and coordinated construction on a scale unmatched in the prehistoric Southwest. The ancestral Puebloans left no writing system that has been identified. They carved petroglyphs and painted pictographs on rock surfaces throughout the Southwest, images of animals, humans, celestial events, and abstract designs. Some of these may encode calendrical information. A famous spiral petroglyph at Chaco Canyon's Fajardo Butte appears to function as a solar marker, catching a dagger of sunlight on the summer solstice in a way that suggests intentional astronomical alignment. But these images do not constitute a writing system in the conventional sense. They do not encode language. They cannot be read as sentences. Whatever knowledge the Chaco people possessed about engineering, astronomy, governance, and ritual, they transmitted orally, through training, through practice, through memory. When the system collapsed, the knowledge went with it. And collapse it did. Between roughly 1150 and 1275 of the Common Era, the Chaco system fell apart. The great houses were abandoned. Construction ceased. The roads were no longer maintained. Population shifted southward and eastward. Tree ring data from the region documents a devastating drought in the late 1200s, sometimes called the Great Drought, that lasted for over 2 decades. But environmental stress alone does not explain the pattern. There is evidence of increasing social conflict, violence, and possibly warfare in the period leading up to the abandonment. Some sites show evidence of violent death, and even, controversially, cannibalism. The social fabric that had held the Chaco world together appears to have unraveled under a combination of environmental, political, and social pressures. When Spanish explorers and missionaries arrived in the southwest, in the 1500s and 1600s, the Pueblo peoples they encountered lived in multi-room adobe and stone structures reminiscent of, but much smaller than, the great houses. These communities had rich oral traditions and complex ceremonial practices, but they had no clear, detailed memory of Chaco Canyon's heights. The great houses were already ancient ruins, attributed to vaguely remembered ancestors. The specific knowledge of how Chaco was built, organized, and governed had faded into the mists of oral tradition. The silence here is not about an unreadable script. It is about the limits of oral memory itself. Even in cultures with strong traditions of oral transmission, the details fade within a few centuries. The broad outlines may survive, the specifics do not. We should also consider a case much closer to the Indus Valley, in terms of its sheer unexpectedness. Cahokia, in the floodplain of the Mississippi River, just east of present-day St. Louis, Missouri, there once stood the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. Cahokia was a city, a genuine city, with a population that may have reached between 10,000 and 20,000 people at its height, around 1050 to 1150 of the Common Era, making it larger than London at the same time. The city's centerpiece was Monk's Mound, a massive earthen platform covering over 5.5 hectares and rising roughly 30 meters above the surrounding plain. It is the largest earthen structure in the Americas. Around it, the Cahokians built over 120 other mounds, erected a circle of timber posts that functioned as a solar calendar, sometimes called Woodhenge, by analogy with Stonehenge, constructed a grand plaza larger than many modern city parks, and maintained a densely populated urban core surrounded by agricultural hinterlands, stretching for kilometers in every direction. The Cahokians had no writing system. They left no inscriptions, no symbols that have been identified as script, no carved messages on their pottery or their mounds. Everything they knew about engineering, astronomy, governance, trade, and religion was stored in living human memories and transmitted through oral tradition, apprenticeship, and practice. When the city was abandoned around 1300 of the Common Era, possibly due to a combination of environmental degradation, deforestation, flooding, social upheaval, and political fragmentation, the knowledge dispersed with the population. Later Native American peoples in the region retained some cultural connections to the Cahokian tradition, but the specific details of the city's organization, its political structure, its religious practices, and the engineering knowledge required to build its massive earthworks were largely lost. When European settlers arrived in the region in the 17th and 18th centuries, they could not believe that Native Americans had built the mounds. Many attributed them to a mythical mound builder race, perhaps Phoenicians, lost Israelites, or Vikings. The denial that indigenous peoples could have built such structures persisted in some circles well into the 19th century. It was a failure not just of memory but of imagination, an inability to accept that a sophisticated civilization could arise, flourish, and vanish so completely that even its most massive physical monuments were attributed to someone else. Let us now turn eastward to the jungles of Southeast Asia. In the dense tropical forest of present-day Cambodia, there lies one of the largest and most magnificent religious monuments ever constructed by human hands, Angkor Wat. Built in the early 1100s during the reign of King Suryavarman II of the Khmer Empire, the temple complex covers an area of roughly 162 hectares. It is surrounded by a moat over 5 kilometers in circumference. Its central tower rises 65 meters above the ground. Its walls are covered with bas-reliefs of extraordinary artistry, depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, historical battles, and the daily life of the Khmer court, stretching for hundreds of meters and containing thousands of individual carved figures. The scale of the construction boggles the modern imagination. The sandstone blocks used to build Angkor Wat were quarried from a mountain over 50 kilometers away and transported to the site, probably by a combination of canal boats and ox carts. The total volume of stone in the temple complex exceeds 5 million tons. The Khmer Empire, which built Angkor, was at its height one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in Southeast Asia, controlling territory across modern Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. The Greater Angkor urban area, revealed by aerial surveys and LiDAR scanning in the 21st century, was vastly larger than the temple complexes alone. LiDAR data published beginning in 2012 showed that the city of Angkor, including its residential areas, rice paddies, canal systems and reservoir networks, covered more than 1,000 square kilometers, making it the most extensive urban complex of the pre-industrial world. Population estimates for Angkor at its peak range from 700,000 to 1 million people or more, which would make it the largest city on Earth during the 12th and 13th centuries. Unlike the Indus civilization, the Khmer Empire was thoroughly literate. It left thousands of inscriptions in Sanskrit and Old Khmer, carved on temple walls, door frames, and freestanding stone steels. These inscriptions record the names and genealogies of kings, the dates of military victories and temple dedications, the boundaries of land grants, the inventory of temple treasuries, and the obligations of temple servants. We can read these inscriptions. We know the names, we know the dates, we know the structure of Khmer society in considerable detail, and yet the civilization collapsed. By the mid-1400s, Angkor had been largely abandoned as a political capital. The causes remain debated. Thai military pressure from the West, overextension and eventual failure of the massive hydraulic infrastructure, the reservoirs and canal systems that sustained the city's agriculture, shifts in maritime trade routes that redirected commerce away from the Mekong region, possibly epidemic disease. The jungle reclaimed the temples with astonishing speed. Massive trees grew through the stonework, their roots cracking walls and toppling towers. Within a few generations, the Khmer people who remained in the region had lost detailed knowledge of Angkor's full extent and purpose. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot visited in 1860, describing the ruins with wonder, local inhabitants attributed the temples to gods, giants, or the work of an ancient race, not to their own ancestors. The Khmer case demonstrates a critical principle. Even a fully literate civilization, one that carved its records into stone, can be forgotten in its essentials within a remarkably short time. The physical inscriptions survive, the temples survive, but the living knowledge of what those inscriptions meant, of how the civilization functioned, of who its people were and how they lived, can evaporate in the space of a few centuries. Stones remember. People forget. There is a particular detail about Angkor that deserves attention in the context of our story. The Khmer inscriptions include over 1,300 texts spanning roughly 6 centuries. Many contain lists of temple personnel, including dancers, musicians, rice paddy workers, and various categories of servants. They enumerate goods donated to temples: gold, silver, cloth, cattle, and rice. They record the founding of hospitals, rest houses, and irrigation works. In other words, they document precisely the kind of administrative and economic information that we wish we had from the Indus Valley. They show us what a literate ancient civilization's records look like when they survive in readable form. They show us the enormous richness of detail that writing preserves, details about individual people, their roles, their obligations, their social status. And they show us, by contrast, how impoverished our understanding of the Indus Valley is. We have the Khmer equivalent of thousands of pages of readable records from Angkor. From the Indus Valley, we have 2 pages of unreadable short texts. The asymmetry is devastating. It is the difference between hearing a conversation clearly and hearing only static. Now consider the most dramatic and devastating example of civilizational collapse from the ancient world: the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 before the Common Era, within a period of roughly 50 years, the interconnected civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean world shattered. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, controlling much of modern Turkey and northern Syria, was destroyed. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. The great trading city of Ugarit, on the coast of modern Syria, one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world, a place where scribes wrote in 7 languages, was sacked and never reoccupied. the Mycenaean palace centers of Greece, the world of kings like Agamemnon, if he existed, were destroyed one by one. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes. Egypt survived, but only barely, fighting off waves of invaders that the Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples, mysterious confederations of warriors who arrived by ship and attacked the Nile Delta. The numbers are striking. Before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean world had at least 4 major literate civilizations operating simultaneously: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Hittites, and Mycenaean Greece. In addition, there were smaller literate polities at Ugarit, in Cyprus, and elsewhere. These civilizations were linked by intensive trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They exchanged letters written on clay tablets. They negotiated treaties. They arranged royal marriages across cultural boundaries. They sent ambassadors to each other's courts. It was, in a real sense, an international system, the first great age of globalization, and then it collapsed. After the destruction, only Egypt and parts of Mesopotamia maintained continuous literate traditions. The Hittite language and its cuneiform script fell out of use entirely, not to be rediscovered until German archaeologists unearthed the Hattusa archives in 1906. Linear B, the writing system of Mycenaean Greece, disappeared completely. Greece entered a period of roughly 400 years, from about 1200 to 800 before the Common Era, known as the Greek Dark Ages, during which writing was entirely absent from the Greek world. When the Greeks finally regained literacy, they did so by adopting an entirely different writing system, the Phoenician alphabet, which bore no relationship to Linear B. Let us pause and absorb the scale of that loss. An entire literate civilization, Mycenaean Greece, lost its writing system for 4 centuries. The knowledge encoded in Linear B tablets, administrative records of palace economies, tracking goods, workers, livestock, and ritual offerings, was sealed away in burned ruins until Arthur Evans discovered the first tablets at Knossos in 1900, and Ventris decoded them over 50 years later. For nearly 3,000 years, the thoughts, records, and administrative workings of a sophisticated civilization were unreadable, and had the palace fires not accidentally baked the clay tablets into permanence, preserving them for archaeologists to find, they would have crumbled to dust long ago. The survival of Linear B was an accident. The destruction of whatever other records the Mycenaeans kept was permanent. Who were the Sea Peoples who contributed to this catastrophe? We still do not know. Egyptian records name several groups: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, and others. Some of these names have been tentatively matched to known peoples. The Pelset may be the Philistines, who settled on the coast of modern Israel and Palestine. The Shekelesh might be connected to Sicily. The Denyen might be the Danans, a Homeric name for the Greeks. But these identifications are uncertain, and the overall origin, motivation, and fate of the Sea Peoples remain among the great unsolved questions of ancient history. Were they refugees fleeing famine and drought? Were they organized military coalitions? Were they a symptom of the collapse rather than its cause? Were they peoples displaced by the very disruptions that toppled the palace civilizations? The debate has continued for over a century without resolution. What is certain is that the Bronze Age collapse was one of the most devastating civilizational disruptions in the human record, a moment when the lights went out across an entire region of the world and took centuries to come back on. The archaeologist Eric Klein, in his influential study of the Bronze Age collapse, has argued that the catastrophe was not caused by any single factor, but by a cascading failure of interconnected systems. Drought reduced agricultural output. Famine drove migration. Migration fueled conflict. Conflict disrupted trade. Trade disruption weakened palace economies. Weakened economies could not maintain armies or infrastructure, and into the resulting vacuum rushed the Sea Peoples, themselves possibly victims of the same cascade. The parallel to the Indus Valley is striking. The Indus decline also appears to involve multiple interacting causes: changes in river courses, particularly the drying up or shifting of the Gagar-Hakra river system, climatic shifts toward greater aridity, possible disruption of monsoon patterns, and internal social or political stresses that are harder to read in the archaeological record. Neither collapse can be attributed to a single dramatic event. Both appear to have been slow-motion catastrophes, unfolding over decades or generations, eroding the foundations of complex societies until those societies could no longer sustain themselves. There is one more parallel worth exploring: the last days of Mohenjo-daro itself. In the uppermost archaeological layers of the city, excavators found evidence of a civilization in decline. The careful urban planning of earlier centuries gave way to haphazard construction. Large buildings were subdivided into smaller rooms, as if once wealthy households were being broken up or repurposed. The sophisticated drainage system fell into disrepair. Kilns and workshops encroached on formerly residential areas. And, in one of the most haunting discoveries at the site, the British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler found, in 1947, a group of about 37 human skeletons scattered across the streets of the upper levels of the city. Some appeared to have died violently. Wheeler initially interpreted this as evidence of a massacre, perhaps by invading Aryan warriors, a theory that was popular in the mid-20th century but has since been largely abandoned. Modern reanalysis of the skeletons suggests that the deaths may have occurred over a longer period and that the bodies may have been left unburied due to a breakdown of social order rather than a single violent event. But whatever the cause, the image is poignant. Bodies lying in the streets of a city that no longer functioned, that no longer had the social cohesion to bury its dead. A city dying not in a blaze of conquest, but in a slow, grinding collapse of the systems that had sustained it for centuries. Let us now return to the Indus Valley, armed with the perspective these comparisons provide. The Indus script's silence is not an anomaly, it belongs to a pattern. Civilizations rise, develop complex systems of knowledge and communication, flourish for centuries, and then fall. When they fall, the knowledge they accumulated does not automatically survive. Sometimes, as with the Hittites, the records are preserved in fire-baked clay, but remain unreadable until modern scholars find the key. Sometimes, as with Mycenaean Greece, the writing system disappears entirely and is replaced by something new. Sometimes, as with the ancestral Puebloans, the knowledge was never committed to a durable medium in the first place, and vanished with the last generation that remembered it. And sometimes, as with the Indus Valley, we are left with a corpus of inscriptions that survive physically, but remain linguistically impenetrable, a tantalizing collection of marks that clearly meant something to someone, but whose meaning has been irretrievably lost. The Indus case is the most extreme and frustrating example of this pattern, because the erasure is so complete and the remaining evidence so meager. The Hittite archives, once found, were decoded relatively quickly because they included bilingual texts, and because the Hittite language turned out to be Indo-European, related to languages scholars already knew. The Mycenaean tablets were decoded because Ventris recognized the language as Greek. Even Sumerian, a language isolate with no known relatives, was deciphered because of the enormous corpus of texts available and because Akkadian Sumerian bilinguals provided the necessary bridge. The Indus script has no such advantages. No bilingual, no identified language, no long texts, no large corpus, no connection to any known writing tradition. It stands alone, surrounded by silence. Let us also look at one of the most recent and ambitious attempts to break through. In 2015, a team of researchers at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai developed a computational framework for analyzing the Indus symbol sequences using what they called a Markov chain model. This model treated each symbol in a text as dependent on the symbols that preceded it, and attempted to identify the statistical rules governing which symbols could follow which. Their analysis suggested that the Indus symbol system had a degree of grammatical structure, with certain positions in the text being occupied by specific categories of signs, analogous to how in English an article like the is typically followed by a noun or an adjective. The results were published in a peer-reviewed journal and added another piece of evidence to the script side of the debate. But Sproat and other skeptics pointed out that structured notation systems can also exhibit positional regularities without being linguistic. A heraldic blazon, for example, follows strict rules about the order of its elements. The shield's division comes first, then the colours, then the charges, then the supporters. This is structure. it is not language. In more recent years, researchers have experimented with deep learning approaches, training neural networks on the Indus corpus to see if artificial intelligence can detect patterns too subtle for human analysis. These experiments are ongoing. Some preliminary results have been published, suggesting that neural networks can identify clusters of related signs and predict missing signs in damaged inscriptions with above-chance accuracy. But prediction is not translation. A machine can learn the statistical regularities of a symbol system without understanding what the symbols mean, just as a parrot can learn to mimic human speech without understanding the words. There is yet another approach that deserves mention, one that takes a completely different path from the computational methods. Several scholars have attempted what might be called the cultural context approach, trying to decode the Indus script not through statistical analysis, but through careful study of the images and objects that accompany the inscriptions. The logic is straightforward. If the seals show identifiable animals, and if the same animals appear consistently with the same symbol sequences, then perhaps the symbols name the animals or describe them in some way. This approach treats the seal images not as mere decoration, but as a kind of visual bilingual, where the picture and the text reinforce each other. The Finnish scholar Parpala has been the most systematic practitioner of this method. He has argued that the fish sign on the seals represents the Dravidian word min, meaning both fish and star. He has proposed that various modifications of the fish sign, fish with additional strokes, fish with comb-like additions, represent specific celestial bodies or astronomical concepts. A fish with 6 additional marks might represent the 6 visible stars of the Pleiades cluster. A fish with a particular modifier might represent the planet Venus. These readings allow Parpola to construct an elaborate system in which the Indus seals function as astrological or religious identifiers, perhaps indicating the birth star or patron deity of the seal's owner. The system is internally coherent and draws on genuine parallels between Indus iconography and later South Asian religious symbolism. It is the most fully developed decipherment proposal ever produced for the Indus script, the product of over 50 years of dedicated scholarship, and yet it has not been accepted by the wider academic community. The criticisms are familiar. The readings depend on the assumption that the language is Dravidian, which has not been proven. The astronomical interpretations, while creative, cannot be verified against independent evidence. The proposed readings produce results that are plausible but not falsifiable, meaning there is no way to test whether they are correct or merely consistent with the assumptions that generated them. Other scholars, using different linguistic assumptions, have produced entirely different readings of the same signs, readings that are equally internally consistent and equally unverifiable. The problem is not that Parpala's work is bad. It may well be correct. The problem is that there is no way to know. There is something almost tragic about the accumulation of these attempts. Each one brings a new tool, a new method, a new angle of attack. Each one achieves a small advance in our understanding of the system's structure, and each one stops short of the goal. The script remains unbroken, the door remains locked, the silence continues. One final dimension of the problem deserves attention before we move on. The Indus script is not just an intellectual puzzle, it is also a political and cultural battleground. In India, the Indus Valley civilization is often invoked in debates about national identity, the relationship between Vedic and pre-Vedic cultures, and the origins of Indian civilization itself. Some Hindu nationalist scholars have argued that the Indus civilization was Vedic, that the Indus people spoke Sanskrit or a closely related language, and that the Indus script should therefore be read as an early form of Vedic writing. This view is rejected by most mainstream archaeologists and linguists, who point out that the Vedic texts describe a pastoral, semi-nomadic society, quite different from the urban, trade-oriented Indus culture. But the political stakes are high. Whoever gets to claim the Indus civilization as their ancestor gets to claim one of the oldest and most impressive civilizations in world history. The script, if it could be read, might settle these debates, or it might not. Either way, Its continued silence allows all parties to project their own narratives onto the blank screen of the unread symbols. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. The deeper truth about the Indus Valley script is not really about the script at all. It is about us. It is about the fragility of everything we have ever built, written, thought, or known. It is about the uncomfortable, even frightening fact that human achievement does not accumulate in some permanent, protected vault. It can be erased, completely, permanently, without warning, without ceremony, without anyone even noticing it is happening until long after it is gone. We tend to think of human history as a progression, a long upward climb from primitive beginnings to modern complexity, each generation standing on the shoulders of the one before. We imagine that knowledge once gained is kept, that discoveries, once made, become permanent parts of the human inheritance, that the march of civilization moves in only one direction, forward. This is a deeply comforting narrative. It is also, in many profound and documented ways, untrue. History is not a smooth escalator rising steadily toward the light. It is a jagged, broken line, full of peaks and collapses, advances and retreats, moments of breathtaking intellectual achievement, followed by centuries of forgetting so complete that later peoples do not even know there is anything to remember. The Indus Valley civilization is one of those peaks, and its disappearance from human memory is one of those collapses. Let that sink in. A civilization that lasted longer than the Roman Republic. A civilization that covered more territory than ancient Egypt. A civilization that may have supported a population of 5 million souls, more than most European kingdoms would contain for thousands of years afterward. Gone, not annihilated by a celestial impact, not swept away by a biblical flood, not exterminated by a conquering army, as far as the archaeological evidence suggests, simply faded. The cities were abandoned, gradually, over the course of several generations. The people dispersed, moving to smaller settlements, shifting their agricultural practices, adapting to changing rivers and changing climates. The sophisticated urban culture, with its standardized bricks and planned streets and meticulous drainage, dissolved, and the writing system, whatever it was no longer used, no longer taught, no longer read, no longer remembered. For roughly 3,500 years after the Indus cities fell silent, no human being on Earth knew that this civilization had existed. No history book mentioned it. No oral tradition preserved its memory with any specificity. No successor culture in South Asia identified itself as an heir to the Indus urban tradition. When Charles Masson stumbled on the bricks of Harappa in 1826, the civilization had been absent from human consciousness for longer than the entire span of recorded Western history, from the earliest Greek texts to the present day. That is a staggering span of oblivion. We should pause to consider what that oblivion contained. It is not just that the name of the civilization was forgotten. It is that the entire world it represented, its physical environment, its social relationships, its economic networks, its artistic traditions, its beliefs about life and death, its understanding of the natural world, all of it disappeared from human awareness. For 35 centuries, the Indus cities lay beneath the earth, their streets filled with dirt, their buildings slowly crumbling under the weight of accumulated sediment, their inscriptions buried in darkness. Above them, new peoples settled, new languages were spoken, new religions arose, new empires came and went. Kingdoms fought wars, made peace, built palaces, and wrote histories, all without the slightest awareness that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization that had once been among the most advanced on Earth. The Indus people had been erased not just from the historical record, but from the imagination of every human culture that came after them. They had achieved the most complete form of death possible, the death of memory itself. And this raises a question that should trouble anyone who values human achievement. How many other civilizations have suffered the same fate? How many cities lie beneath our feet, unknown, unexcavated, unimagined? How many writing systems were developed, used for centuries, and then lost without leaving any trace that modern archaeology has detected? We tend to think that the civilizations we know about, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Rome, Greece, the Maya, the Inca, represent the totality of the ancient world's achievements. But they may represent only what survived. They may be the lucky ones, the civilizations whose records were carved in stone, or baked in clay, or preserved in desert dryness. The unlucky ones, those who wrote on wood, on bark, on cloth, on palm leaves, or on nothing at all, have vanished. We do not even know their names. We do not know that we do not know them. Think about what that means for our own time. We live in a world saturated with information. We have billions of books in libraries around the world. We have trillions of digital documents stored on servers, hard drives, magnetic tapes, and in what we euphemistically call the cloud, which is simply someone else's computer in a windowless building. We have scientific journals publishing thousands of papers every day. We have the internet, a network connecting billions of devices, carrying more information in a single second than the entire ancient world produced in a millennium. We assume that this information is permanent, or at least durable. We assume that future generations will be able to access it, read it, understand it, and build on it. We assume that the chain of knowledge transmission that has brought us to this point will continue unbroken into the foreseeable future. But the Indus Valley civilization had information too. It had systems of knowledge storage and transmission too. It had administrative records, commercial communications, and quite possibly literary, religious, and legal texts. And every trace of that knowledge vanished. The mechanisms of knowledge loss are more varied and more insidious than most people realize. There is catastrophic loss, the sudden, dramatic destruction of information through fire, flood, war, or natural disaster. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, though its details are debated and its scale often exaggerated in popular culture, is the archetypal example. But catastrophic loss, while devastating, is at least visible. People notice when a library burns. There is grief, outrage, a record of the destruction itself. Far more dangerous is gradual loss, the slow, silent erosion of knowledge through neglect, disuse, and cultural change. This is the kind of loss that appears to have afflicted the Indus Valley. No invading army burned their archives. As far as we know, no conquering emperor ordered their books destroyed, as happened to so many Mesoamerican codices under the Spanish. The knowledge simply leaked away, like water seeping through the cracks of a stone vessel, so slowly that no one noticed the vessel was emptying until it was dry. This is not science fiction. This is the documented, verified, archaeologically confirmed history of one of the greatest civilizations in the human record, and it has happened more times than the Indus case alone. Consider the knowledge losses that accompanied the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Roman civilization at its height possessed a vast body of technical, scientific, philosophical, and literary knowledge. Roman engineers built aqueducts that carried water across kilometers of rugged terrain with a gradient so precise that the water descended only a few centimeters per kilometer. They built roads that endured for centuries. They developed concrete, a hydraulic mixture that hardened even underwater, using volcanic ash from the region of Pozzuoli, a substance we now call pozzolana. This Roman concrete was used to construct the Pantheon in Rome, whose dome, at roughly 43 meters in diameter, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, more than 1800 years after its completion. After the fall of Rome, the formula for this concrete was lost. European builders would not match the quality and durability of Roman concrete for over 1,000 years. The knowledge was not suppressed. It was not censored. It simply stopped being transmitted. The craftsmen who knew the recipes died, and no one had been trained to replace them. Consider also the Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, sponge divers working off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera recovered a corroded lump of bronze and wood from a Roman-era shipwreck. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for decades, attracting occasional curiosity, but no systematic study. It was not until the 1950s and 60s that researchers, using X-ray imaging, began to understand what the object actually was: a mechanical astronomical calculator of extraordinary sophistication. The device contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears. It could predict the positions of the sun and moon, the dates of eclipses, the phases of the moon, and even the timing of the ancient Olympic Games. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity would appear in the Western historical record for over 1,000 years. until the mechanical clocks of medieval European cathedrals. The knowledge to design and build such a device existed in the Hellenistic world, and then it did not. The chain of transmission was broken. The skills, the mathematical knowledge, the precision metalworking techniques, all vanished from the record. Consider also the case of Greek fire. This was a devastating, incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire from roughly the 7th through the 12th century of the Common Era. It could be projected from siphons mounted on warships, and according to contemporary accounts, it burned on water, igniting enemy vessels even as they tried to escape across the sea. It was used to defend Constantinople against multiple Arab and later Russian sieges, and it may have been decisive in preserving the Byzantine state during its most vulnerable centuries. The formula for Greek fire was a closely guarded military secret, known only to a small number of specialists and closely controlled by the imperial family. When the Byzantine Empire weakened and eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the formula died with it. Despite centuries of speculation and research by chemists and military historians, no one has been able to reconstruct the exact composition with certainty. Proposals have included mixtures of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and resin, but none have been conclusively demonstrated. The knowledge was too concentrated, too closely held, too dependent on a small group of specialists. When those specialists were gone, the knowledge was gone too. These examples illustrate a critical point about the vulnerability of knowledge. Broad knowledge, knowledge that is widely distributed across a population, is relatively resilient. Millions of people know how to cook rice, and that knowledge is unlikely to be lost, as long as rice is grown and eaten. Narrow knowledge, knowledge held by only a few specialists, is extraordinarily fragile. A single disruption, a war, a plague, an economic collapse, a political revolution, can wipe out the small community of experts who hold the knowledge, and with them, the knowledge itself. Let that sink in. A mechanical computer, built before the Common Era, using gear technology that would not reappear for a millennium. That knowledge was not destroyed by barbarian invasions. It was not lost in a single dramatic event. It was lost through the gradual dissolution of the intellectual culture that produced it. When the schools closed, when the workshops shut down, when the trained craftsmen grew old and died without passing on their skills, the knowledge died with them. Knowledge is not a substance that can be stored in a jar. It is a living process, sustained only by continuous practice and transmission. When the practice stops, the knowledge stops, permanently. The Indus script represents the most extreme version of this phenomenon. It is not a single technology that was lost, like concrete or gear train computation. It is the entire symbolic system through which a civilization communicated. If the Indus script is a true writing system, its loss means that the thoughts, beliefs, identities, and records of 5 million people have been rendered permanently inaccessible. Not because the physical inscriptions were destroyed, but because the interpretive framework, the knowledge of which sounds or meanings each symbol represents, ceased to exist in any human mind. How does a writing system die? The mechanisms are not mysterious, they are in fact quite ordinary, even mundane. A writing system is sustained by a community of users, people who can read and write it, who teach it to their children or their students, who use it in daily life for commerce administration, worship, or personal expression. That community is maintained by institutions, schools that teach the script, governments that require it, religious establishments that use it in ritual, commercial networks that depend on it for contracts and records. When those institutions weaken, the community of users shrinks. When the community shrinks below a certain threshold, the system becomes endangered. When it falls below a critical minimum, it dies. This process has been observed in modern times. Many of the world's current writing systems are endangered, used by dwindling populations, no longer taught in schools, and no longer used for official purposes. The Canadian syllabics used by some indigenous communities, the traditional Mongolian script being replaced by Cyrillic, the Enko alphabet of West Africa struggling for recognition, all face pressures that could lead to their abandonment within a few generations. We can watch this process happening in real time. We can see how economic incentives, political decisions, educational policies, and demographic shifts combined to push a writing system from widespread use to specialist knowledge to museum curiosity to oblivion. The same forces operated in the ancient world. They operated in the Indus Valley. They will operate again. This process can happen remarkably quickly in historical terms. Egyptian hieroglyphics were in continuous use for over 3,000 years, from roughly the 31st century before the Common Era to the late 4th century of the Common Era. But after the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of pagan temples in 391, the number of people who could read hieroglyphics dwindled rapidly. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Isis at Philae in 394 of the Common Era. Within a generation or two, the ability to read the script had been lost. It would remain lost for over 1,400 years, until Champollion cracked the code in the 1820s. The chain of transmission was broken in a single human lifetime. 14 centuries of silence followed. For the Indus script, the chain was broken around 1900 before the Common Era. The silence has lasted over 4,000 years, and unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics, there is no Rosetta Stone waiting to be found. There may never be one. The silence may be permanent. We may have to accept that the words of the Indus people are gone, sealed behind a code that cannot be broken, not because it is complex, but because the key no longer exists anywhere in the world. There is a particular kind of grief associated with this realization. It is not the grief of losing something we once had. It is the grief of realizing that something irreplaceable existed, that it mattered, and that it is gone beyond all recovery. The Indus people's words were not unimportant. They were the vehicle through which an entire civilization communicated with itself, organized its affairs, expressed its identity, and perhaps recorded its understanding of the world. Those words mattered to the people who wrote them. They mattered to the people who read them. They were part of the fabric of daily life for millions of individuals across centuries of time. And now they are not merely unread. They are unreadable. There is a difference. An unread book can be picked up and read at any time. An unreadable inscription exists in a kind of permanent twilight, physically present but semantically absent. A ghost of meaning that can never be summoned back to life. The deeper truth, the one that hides behind the academic debates and the computational analyses and the scholarly conferences, is this: we are always one catastrophe, one disruption, one generational failure away from losing everything we know. The chain of knowledge is only as strong as the weakest link, and the weakest link is always the present, because the present is the only link that is still being forged. Then something happened that changed everything. Not in the dusty ruins of the Indus Valley, not in the hushed archives of museums, but in our growing, uncomfortable awareness of what the fate of the Indus script means for the world we are building right now. What does the silence of the Indus script mean for us? What does it say about the world we inhabit, the civilization we have constructed, the knowledge we produce and consume and store and transmit? The answer is more unsettling than we might expect. Because the Indus script's fate is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a mirror, and the reflection it offers is not flattering. We live in an age of unprecedented information production. The volume of data generated by the human species each year exceeds anything that would have been conceivable even a few decades ago. We have libraries, universities, research institutes, government archives, corporate databases, and personal storage devices containing more information than every previous generation of humanity combined. We have built systems of extraordinary complexity to organize, index, search, and retrieve this information. We have redundancy, backup protocols, distributed storage networks, and international cooperation agreements designed to protect critical knowledge from loss. We believe, with what feels like solid justification, that the knowledge we produce today will be accessible tomorrow, next year, next century. But the Indus Valley civilization believed something similar. It must have. A society that standardized its weights across 1,000,000 square kilometers, that planned its cities on grid systems, that maintained uniform brick dimensions, from the Himalayan foothills to the Arabian Sea coast, obviously had systems for transmitting knowledge across space and time. It had institutional memory. It had training traditions. It had means of recording and sharing information, whether those means were written texts on perishable materials, oral instruction, apprenticeship systems, or some combination of all three. And all of those systems failed. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but completely. Within a few centuries of the civilization's decline, the knowledge was gone. The writing, if it was writing, was unreadable. The language, whatever it was, had no obvious continuity with any later tradition. The memory had vanished as though it had never been. We are quick to dismiss such parallels. We tell ourselves that our civilization is different. We have digital storage. We have the internet. We have institutions dedicated specifically to preservation, like the Internet Archive, the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the great national libraries of Europe and Asia. We have international agreements protecting cultural heritage. We have redundancy built into our systems at every level. Surely, we argue, our knowledge is safe. But consider the fragility of our own information infrastructure. Digital storage media have remarkably short lifespans. A magnetic hard drive typically lasts between 5 and 10 years before it begins to degrade. Solid-state drives may last somewhat longer, but they too are subject to data loss over time, particularly if they are not powered on regularly. Optical discs, once touted as a long-term storage solution, degrade within decades, sometimes within years if the manufacturing quality is poor. Magnetic tape, still used for archival storage by major institutions, has a usable lifespan of perhaps 15 to 30 years under ideal conditions. Compare these lifespans to the 4,000 years that have passed since the Indus script was last read, and the disparity is sobering. Our most durable digital storage medium would need to be replaced more than 100 times over to bridge that gap. And then there is the problem of format obsolescence. Even if the physical medium survives, the data stored on it must be readable by software and hardware that may no longer exist. Try reading a 5¼ inch floppy disk today. Try opening a file saved in the WordStar format, popular in the 1980s. Try accessing a website built in Adobe Flash. Try playing a Laserdisc. The hardware is unavailable. The software is unsupported. The formats are obsolete. And these are formats that are only a few decades old. Now imagine a future archaeologist, 1,000 years from now, trying to read a USB drive. They would need to understand not only the physical interface, but also the file system, the encoding standard, the operating system, and the application-specific format in which the data was stored. Without that stack of interlocking knowledge, the data on the drive is as unreadable as the Indus script. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is a phenomenon that is already happening. Researchers call it digital dark age, a term coined by the computer scientist Vinton Cerf, one of the architects of the internet. Cerf warned that vast quantities of digital information are being lost every year, not because of catastrophic events, but because of the ordinary processes of technological change. Formats are superseded, hardware is discontinued, websites go offline, cloud storage companies go bankrupt, personal data is scattered across devices and platforms that become inaccessible. The sum of these small losses, accumulated over time, could produce a gap in the historical record comparable to the gap left by the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization. The parallel is not perfect, of course. Our civilization has levels of redundancy that the Indus people almost certainly lacked. Important texts exist in thousands or millions of copies, distributed across the globe. Scientific knowledge is published in journals, archived in multiple locations. Cultural works are reproduced, translated, and adapted across languages and media. A single disaster, or even a series of disasters, would not erase everything. But redundancy is not infinity, and the patterns of information loss in the digital age are different from anything humanity has experienced before. Previous civilizations lost knowledge when physical objects were destroyed, or when human communities were disrupted. We face the additional challenge of technological obsolescence, the possibility that our records will survive physically but become inaccessible because the technology needed to read them no longer exists. The Indus seals survive. The Indus symbols are physically intact. But the technology to read them, the human brain trained in the Indus writing system, is gone. Our digital records may face an analogous fate. The disks may survive, but the machines and software to read them may not. There is a philosophical dimension to this problem that deserves our careful attention. What does it mean for a civilization to be forgotten? The Indus Valley people were not abstract historical actors. They were human beings. They were parents, children, friends, rivals, lovers, mourners, dreamers. They had names, though we cannot read them. They had stories, though we cannot hear them. They had beliefs about the world and their place in it, hopes for their children, memories of their parents, opinions about their neighbours. They experienced joy, sorrow, boredom, excitement, fear and love, all the textures of human experience that make a life. All of that, the entire inner world of millions of people across hundreds of years, has been reduced to a collection of artifacts in display cases. We can measure their skulls. We can analyze the isotopes in their bones to determine what they ate. We can study their dental wear to estimate their age at death. But we cannot hear a single one of their voices. We cannot read a single word they wrote. We cannot know a single thought they had. This is a form of death that goes deeper than the physical. When a person dies, their body ceases to function. But if their writings survive, if their words are read and discussed by future generations, something of their presence persists. Homer has been dead for perhaps 2,800 years, but his words live. They are read, debated, translated, adapted, performed. He exists, in a meaningful sense, in every classroom where a student encounters Achilles or Odysseus. The anonymous scribes who carved the Indus inscriptions are equally dead, but their words are not alive. Their inscriptions exist physically, as shapes on stone, as indentations in clay. But they have no voice, they carry no meaning, they communicate nothing. They are, in the fullest and most absolute sense, dead words. There is a temptation to romanticize this mystery. The undeciphered script has a certain glamour. It attracts dreamers, puzzle solvers, and seekers of hidden knowledge. Every few years, someone announces that they have cracked the Indus Code, and for a brief moment, the media buzzes with excitement before the scholarly community examines the claim and finds it wanting. The romance is understandable, but it obscures the more sober reality. The Indus script may never be deciphered. The evidence may not exist. The key may have been destroyed millennia ago. And if that is the case, then the silence is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a verdict already delivered, a permanent sentence of oblivion. There is also a deeper question embedded in this silence, one that touches on the nature of meaning itself. We assume that meaning resides in symbols, that a written word carries its meaning the way a vessel carries water. But the Indus script shows us that this is an illusion. Meaning does not reside in symbols. Meaning resides in the relationship between symbols and the minds that interpret them. A symbol without a reader is not meaningful but misunderstood. It is not meaningful at all. It is a shape, a mark, an arrangement of lines on a surface. The meaning was never in the stone. It was in the person who looked at the stone and understood. When that person died, when the chain of understanding was broken, the meaning died too. The stone remained, the mark remained, but the meaning was gone. This is, in a sense, the most unsettling implication of the Indus script's silence. It tells us that meaning is mortal, that the relationship between a symbol and its interpretation is not a permanent feature of the universe, but a fragile, contingent, human creation sustained only by living minds and their continuous effort to understand and transmit. When we write, we do not fix meaning in place. We create a prompt, a signal, that requires a trained mind to activate. Without that mind, the signal goes unheard. The symbols sit in silence. What we are left with is a confrontation with the limits of human knowledge. We can learn a great deal about the Indus Valley civilization from its material remains. We can map its cities. We can date its phases. We can reconstruct its trade routes. We can analyze its metallurgy, its agriculture, its craft traditions, its dietary practices. Archaeologists have done, and continue to do, extraordinary work in recovering the material dimensions of this lost world. But we cannot access its mind. We cannot read its thoughts. We cannot enter the world of meaning, the shared symbols and stories and concepts that its people inhabited. That world is sealed, and it may remain sealed forever. This should give us pause, not just about the past, but about the present. Not just about the Indus Valley, but about ourselves. Every piece of knowledge that we possess today, every scientific discovery, every literary masterpiece, every legal precedent, every technological innovation, every folk recipe and lullaby and joke exists only because it has been continuously transmitted from the moment of its creation to this very instant. If that chain of transmission is interrupted, for any reason, at any point, the knowledge is gone. It does not matter how brilliant the discovery was. It does not matter how many people once knew it. If the chain breaks, the knowledge dies. The Indus Valley is proof. We are not building on bedrock. We are building on a chain of human effort, and every link in that chain is a choice. The choice to learn, to teach, to preserve, to fund institutions, to maintain archives, to transmit, to care. When those choices stop being made, when funding is cut, when institutions are neglected, when the effort of transmission is deferred to the next generation or the generation after that, the chain weakens. And when the chain breaks, silence follows. The silence of the Indus script has lasted more than 4,000 years. It may last forever. There is a small stone seal in the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi. It sits behind glass in a climate-controlled display case, illuminated by carefully calibrated lights, surrounded by other artifacts from the same vanished world. The seal is roughly 2.5 centimeters square, carved from steatite, and it bears the image of an animal, perhaps a bull, perhaps the mysterious single-horned creature that scholars call the unicorn. Above the animal image, there is a line of 5 symbols, 5 small marks carved by a human hand roughly 4,300 years ago. The hand that carved those symbols knew exactly what they meant. The craftsman who made the seal understood their significance. The merchant or official who carried the seal in a pouch at their waist, who pressed it into soft clay to mark a package of goods or authenticate a transaction, knew what those 5 symbols communicated. The person who received the sealed package and broke the clay, who looked at the impression and read the symbols, understood them instantly, as effortlessly as you understand the words you are hearing now. We do not know what those symbols say. We do not know if they spell a name, a title, a prayer, a profession, a place of origin, or a blessing. We do not know if they represent sounds, ideas, or some combination of the two. We do not know if they should be read from left to right, from right to left, or from top to bottom. We do not know what language they encode, if they encode a language at all. We have the shapes, we have the forms, we have the physical object preserved by the earth for 43 centuries, waiting in the darkness for someone to dig it up and hold it in the light. But we do not have the meaning. The shapes are there, but the voice that would animate them is silent. The message is present, but the understanding is absent. We have the bones of the communication, but not its breath. This is the silence of the Indus Valley script, not the silence of an empty room, where no one is present and nothing is being said. Something harder, something stranger. The silence of a room where someone is speaking, clearly and distinctly, in a language that no listener alive can comprehend. The words are there, the intention is there, the act of communication is there, frozen in stone, preserved across millennia. But the bridge between the speaker and the listener has collapsed. The crossing is gone, and all the engineering in the world, all the scholarship, all the computation, all the brilliant guesswork, has not been able to rebuild it. We live in a civilization that prizes knowledge above almost everything else. We celebrate discovery, we reward innovation, we fund research, we build institutions dedicated to the acquisition, organization, and preservation of human understanding. We believe, and we have good reason to believe, in the power of human reason to illuminate the dark corners of the unknown. We have split atoms, we have mapped genomes, we have sent machines to the outer reaches of our solar system. We have decoded ancient scripts that were once thought permanently lost. We have read the Dead Sea Scrolls, translated the hieroglyphics of the pharaohs, deciphered the syllables of Linear B, and reconstructed the lost languages of civilizations buried for millennia beneath the sands of the Middle East. And yet, here is a corner of the unknown that remains dark. Here is a set of symbols that the combined intellectual resources of modern civilization, aided by a century and a half of effort, have not been able to read. The Indus script does not challenge us with its complexity. Many scripts are complex, and many have been cracked. It challenges us with its poverty, the smallness of its corpus, the shortness of its texts, the absence of any external key. It is not a fortress that can be stormed. It is a whisper in a language no one speaks, too faint to be heard, too brief to be analysed, too isolated to be placed in context. The lesson this silence offers is not one of despair. It is not a counsel of nihilism or futility. It is instead an invitation to humility. We are not the masters of time, we are its passengers. The things we build, the things we write, the things we know and cherish and pass on to our children, all of them are carried by a current that flows in one direction and does not slow down. The libraries can burn, the servers can crash, the languages can be forgotten. The institutions that preserve our knowledge can crumble, as all institutions eventually do, unless they are actively and continuously maintained. And when those supports give way, the knowledge they held does not retreat into some cosmic warehouse, waiting to be reclaimed when conditions improve. It simply ceases to exist, as completely and as irrevocably as the meaning of those 5 symbols on a seal in Karachi. The Indus Valley people did not know that their writing would become unreadable. They did not know that their cities, once the pride of the ancient world, would be buried under meters of river silt and desert sand. They did not know that the civilization they had built and maintained for centuries would fade from human memory so thoroughly that its very existence would remain unknown for 3.5 millennia. They lived as we all live, in the reasonable assumption of continuity. They assumed that the world they knew would persist, that their children would inherit their knowledge, that the skills they had learned and the systems they had built would continue to function after they were gone, that the meaning of their symbols would endure. It did not endure, and that is the quiet, enduring truth at the center of this story. Not merely that the Indus script is undeciphered, though it is. Not merely that it may never be deciphered, though it may not. But that it was once fully known, once read with ease, once understood by millions, once as clear and natural as breathing, and it died not in a fire, not in a flood, not in a battle, but slowly, gradually, one forgotten reader at a time, one unattended lesson at a time, one generation at a time, until the last person who could read those symbols drew their final breath, and the meaning they had carried in their mind passed away with them, and no one noticed, and the silence began. We carry our own symbols. We inscribe our own meanings. We build our own cities and fill them with our own knowledge and trust them to endure. We pour our thoughts into digital vessels and send them spinning through fiber optic cables and satellite uplinks, confident that someone, somewhere, someday will receive them and understand them. And perhaps they will. Perhaps we have built something durable enough, distributed enough, redundant enough, to survive whatever disruptions the future may bring. Perhaps our civilization will be the one that breaks the pattern, that maintains its chain of knowledge unbroken across the centuries and the millennia. Or perhaps not. Perhaps, in some quiet museum in a city we cannot imagine, in a time we cannot foresee, a scholar will hold a small glass rectangle, a device from our age, and stare at its dark, cracked surface, and run it under a scanner, and wonder what the faint patterns etched into its circuits once meant. Perhaps they will write papers about it. Perhaps they will develop algorithms to decode it. Perhaps they will spend careers trying. Perhaps they will fail. The Indus Valley script does not answer our questions. It does not comfort us. It does not promise us that our knowledge is safe. It asks us, in a voice made of silence, whether we are wise enough to preserve what we know, whether we are humble enough to recognize that preservation is not guaranteed by progress, whether we are clear-eyed enough to understand that everything we have built rests on a chain of human effort that must be renewed, link by link, generation by generation, or it will fail. 5 symbols on a small stone seal, carved by a hand that has been dust for over 4,000 years, carrying a message that was once as clear and immediate as sunlight falling on an open palm, as natural and effortless as one friend calling another's name across a crowded market square, and that is now as dark and distant as the furthest reaches of the night sky. The hand is gone, the voice is gone, the meaning is gone. The world that gave those symbols their purpose, the bustling streets, the crowded markets, the workshops echoing with the tap of the seal carver's chisel, the harbour where ships from distant Mesopotamia unloaded their cargoes, All of it has returned to dust and silences. But the symbols remain, waiting, silent, unread.